Hello, I'm Dr. Yvette Rubidoux, and I'm the Vice President for Research and Director of the Policy Research Center at the National Congress of American Indians. The topic of this presentation is the 2020 Census, Data Privacy versus Data Accuracy. Now that the 2020 census count is done, we have an issue that we want everyone, including tribal leaders, to start learning more about. The issue of the privacy methods that the U.S. Census Bureau will apply to the census data and how that might impact the quality or accuracy of the census data and have impacts on how it is used. In this presentation, we are talking about the 2020 census, which is the Decennial Census, which occurs once every 10 years and is required in the U.S. Constitution. The goal of the Decennial Census is a complete count of all persons living in the U.S. The census helps determine apportionment or the counts in each state to determine how many representatives the state will have in the U.S. House of Representatives. And this is not the American Community Survey or ACS. That's a sample of the population and is not a complete count. That is done every year and looks at social economic characteristics of the population. The 2020 Decennial Census is about counting people and asking only a few demographic and housing questions. The Decennial 2020 Census is very important for American Indian and Alaska Native tribal nations. It's used for redistricting in the states and determines how American Indians and Alaska Natives will be represented in that national, state, and local legislatures. It is used in federal funding decisions and formulas. We saw that with the CARES Act. And if these counts are not accurate, it can mean the difference between a small amount or no dollars to millions of dollars. It is used for local tribal governance, decisions, grant applications, and local planning. And it's used for American Indian and Alaska Native research and surveillance. The census numbers are used for a lot of denominators and rates of things like COVID-19. Remember how the Navajo Nation illustrated that using the 2020 census counts versus more recent population estimates changed how their numbers compared to New York State, and so on. So having accurate quality 2020 census data is very critical for American Indian and Alaska Native tribal nations. There were, however, many challenges during the 2020 census operations. There was a slow start due to COVID-19 and the shutdowns, a slow pace of hiring census workers, especially in tribal communities, challenges with competing priorities, economic challenges, and so on. Confusions about deadline. The end of the census was extended to September 30th, then October 30th, then October 5th, and then October 15th. The Census Bureau first requested Congress to extend the statutory deadlines for apportionment and redistricting files, which require a legislative fix, and then they didn't want it. There was a shortened time for data processing after the count, half the usual time, and concerns about the quality there, and litigation. The count suddenly ended on October 15, 2020, after a Supreme Court decision with little notice. So there will be accuracy issues related to the shortened time for the count and potential issues on processing as well. Despite these challenges, the 2020 census self-response rates by phone, mail, or online increased by about a third since July with lots of tribal efforts. However, only one NCII region was able to surpass the self-response rates from 2010. Now, more have responded than this, but the update, enumerate, update, leave, non-response, follow-up, and other enumerations such as group orders, colleges, and prisons make it unclear how much more enumeration actually occurred during these operations. And even though the U.S. Census Bureau says the operations were 99% complete, that does not mean that there was a 99% count. The use of administrative records by the U.S. Census Bureau is still a question as they process the data, and American Indians and Alaska Natives are likely underrepresented in those records. The focus of the rest of this presentation will be on the new census privacy methods and their potential impact on the accuracy of American Indian and Alaska Native data and data in tribal lands or geographies. The process for the 2020 census, in the most basic sense, is first the count, then the data processing, which is happening now, and then privacy methods are applied. And these all lead to the data products that summarize the 2020 census data. Now, the issue we are discussing today is about the 2020 census privacy methods and how they result in an unfortunate balance between privacy versus quality or accuracy. The US Census Bureau is required to protect the privacy of individual data in the census under Title 13, but now they're claiming there's a new issue about third-party data sets being a threat to privacy when combined with census data products. Some are arguing that this is way beyond the purpose of Title 13, but that might be decided in the courts. So the Census Bureau decided to protect privacy in 2020, and they developed what is called a disclosure avoidance system, or abbreviated as DAS, to apply methods to the census data to keep individual data private. In 2010, they did apply some privacy protections, but they were still able to publish data products for various geographies and population groups. However, we started hearing in 2019 that they were applying some new methods for the 2020 census called differential privacy. And then they announced that they would also be doing post-processing, all to increase the privacy protections. But the problem is that with more of these privacy protections, the data ends up less accurate and of poor quality, and some of it may not be available or usable at all. And we found out for American and Alaska Native data, including data on tribal nations and their geographies, is especially impacted with a reduction in counts, or in some cases, even zero numbers for some tribal nations or lands, which is completely unacceptable. It turns out small, rural, and remote populations are most adversely impacted by these new privacy methods, and many tribal nations are small, rural, and remote. All the steps in the 2020 census process impact the data products at the end, but the privacy methods may have a potentially big impact. The US Census Bureau Group 1 products are a little different this year. The apportionment file, or the count of state populations, was supposed to go to the president by the end of the year, but is delayed until April. The redistricting file was to go to the states by April 1st, but we're hearing it will be delayed to June or even July. And the Group 2 products, which had more detail about, for example, racial and ethnic groups, are actually in question due to the impact of the privacy methods, including the American and Alaska Native summary file. We heard they may not be able to produce it at all, primarily because of the new census data privacy methods, making it too inaccurate or too unusable. Here's a diagram that has more detail about the data products and the privacy methods in the process. First, the census form data is all collected into a raw data file, and then it goes to the census unedited file that will be used to make the apportionment file. Then they create a census edited file. That file then has the privacy methods applied to it, here in purple, and then a detailed microdata file is created, and that is used to create the Group 1 data products, the redistricting file and demographic and housing files. And at this time, we really don't know what's going to happen to the American and Alaska Native summary file, whether they're going to publish it or how they're going to do it, and other Group 2 products because of the potential impact of the proposed privacy methods. And as we stated before, the dates on this file have been pushed back in this current year. So with the low response rates in the census count, the shortened data processing time, and now the census privacy methods that may cause inaccuracies in American and Alaska Native data, including for tribal geographies or lands, the accuracy and availability of the census data products we rely on is now in question. Now here's the timelines for the 2020 census data products after the enumeration and the timelines for the privacy methods or DAS to be applied to it. So the count ended in October. The Census Bureau has a committee called the Data Stewardship Executive Committee, or DSEP, that is going to be making all the key decisions about the privacy methods related to, for example, what parts will be held constant in the data. And that decision was made on November 24th, and that impacts the accuracy of the census data moving forward. Then the US Census Bureau is working on the data to create the apportionment counts for delivery to the president, which now looks like it's going to be in April. And then they create the microdata file that is used to create the redistricting file, which now looks like it will go out in June. And they are due to make some important decisions about the privacy methods sometime soon, maybe February or March. We're still waiting to hear. So a lot is sort of up in the air right now. Then we don't know what they plan after the rest of the traditional Group 1 products go out and what they're going to do with the Group 2 products. So these timelines are important because it means there still is opportunity for input. And that's why we need everyone to respond to the tribal consultation on this topic and attend the tribal consultation webinar on February 18th as soon as possible and send in input as soon as possible. So here's more on the timeline. Just to summarize, we found out about this issue way back in spring of 2019, and we convened an American Indian Alaska Native Census data users group to help, since this is statistically complicated. And we wrote a letter to the US Census Bureau that helped get a tribal consultation in the fall of 2019, which you may know was not very effective at AFN and NCAI, but we did pass a resolution that urges tribal consultation until we get a solution to have confidential and accurate data for American Indians and Alaska Natives. Another key part of the timeline is that in October 2019, the first 2010 census demonstration product was released so anyone could analyze it to see the impact of differential privacy and the DAS at that time. At a notable December 2019 workshop, you may have heard that there was lots of analysis of the demonstration product data with the privacy methods applied showing really unacceptable impacts on data quality for lots of groups and lots of areas. Remember, we were complaining that many of the smaller tribal nations resulted in counts of 0 or even negative numbers. And even the US Census Bureau agreed the results were unacceptable. A few more data releases have occurred in 2020. A third data release was touted to have improvements for tribal nations in the fall of 2020, but then they announced that there was a big error that made it uninterpretable, and experts are advising not to analyze it. And then they released a fourth demonstration product, and our analysis shows the data for tribal geographies isn't improving and might even be worse. And then the US Census Bureau planned a tribal consultation webinar in December, but it's now postponed to February 18th, 2020, and that's what we're holding this briefing for. With all the quality concerns to date, with the low response count, the shortened data processing, we can't afford more accuracy issues with the privacy methods. This is a complex topic, and the data releases have shown some troubling results after application of the new privacy methods. So we needed some innovative ways of translating the impact for non-statistical stakeholders. So now Gwen Evans-Loma-Yesva will show you the potential impact of the DAS using data mapping in a more visual manner. Gwen, you can take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'll be speaking about our interactive maps and visuals on the impacts that the census privacy measures are having on tribal nations. We created these maps to visually help and show the data produced by the US Census Bureau from their disclosure avoidance system demonstration products and privacy protected microdata files. These are what Dr. Rubidoux mentioned earlier that the Census Bureau is producing to show how the privacy measures impact data as they continue to work to fix the problems. I'll be referring to the data from the demonstration products and the privacy protected microdata files as tests and test results throughout this presentation. I'll be referring to them as such because the demonstration products are results from the US Census Bureau testing how the adjustments to their privacy measures are working. The results from each test aren't options to choose from. They're updated statuses of the privacy methods. Each test is a result of adjustments to the privacy measures based off the results from the previous test and should theoretically be improving the data. This is the goal, at least. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing in the results for American Indian and Alaska Natives. The data is not improving, and even got worse between the first and the second test and between the third and the fourth test. Tribal nations are losing significant portions of their populations under these privacy measures. Some are still losing 100% of their 2010 Summary File 1 American Indian and Alaska Native alone population. A loss in population directly impacts a loss in money calculated from federal funding formulas. What all 4 tests can show is that each time the privacy is tested on the data, it's a complete gamble as to whether your tribal nation will lose a significant portion of population or gain a small amount of population from your neighbors. The nature of the system is that it's random, and everyone is taking a chance that they will lose or maybe gain population. So the key things to remember as we go through the visuals on the next few slides is that the data shows the impacts of the privacy system are. First, the data is not improving so far. It might be improving for the US population overall, but not for American Indian and Alaska Natives, especially the small, rural, and remote tribal nations. Second, the privacy measures are a complete random gamble for whether you gain or lose population. You are taking a chance that will impact your nation for the next 10 years. And thirdly, the loss of total population equates to a loss in money because you will have a lower population total in your funding formula. Next slide. So now we're moving on to the maps. The data used in these maps was produced by the US Census Bureau. This first map, what we see here, is from the 2010 Census Summary File 1 dataset. In the next 4 maps after this slide, they're created from tests the Census Bureau conducted and publicly released as they fixed or attempted to fix their privacy measures. These datasets are what the US Census Bureau created to show how the privacy measures work, and they were meant to show that the privacy methods were improving in data quality. This first map shows 2010 census data for total American Indian and Alaska Native alone population on tribal lands. The darker colors represent higher population totals, and the lighter colors represent smaller population totals. The next 4 maps show the population losses and gains due to the privacy measures and the attempts to fix the privacy measures from harming tribal nations. Tribal areas that are colored in red represent the tribal areas with population losses. Tribal areas colored in green represent the tribal areas with population gains. And these are compared to what's shown on this slide, the 2010 Census Summary File 1 American Indian Alaska Native alone population. Remember that these maps were created to visually show the data produced from the US Census Bureau for the use of differential privacy in the disclosure avoidance system. And theoretically, the data should be getting better each new slide we get to. Next slide. This shows the first test run the US Census Bureau released of the disclosure avoidance system on the 2010 Census Summary File 1 data. This led to mass population loss for tribal lands, some reaching almost 2,000 American Indian and Alaska Native alone individuals lost from the populations. This is a huge loss for federal funding formulas and will be thousands, if not millions of dollars lost for those specific tribal nations. Even with tribal nations that lose 10 people, that still represents several $1,000s lost because part of that population won't exist in the funding formula anymore. Next slide. This is the second test run of the disclosure avoidance system that the Census Bureau released results for. You can see between these 2 slides that the nations that gained population and the nations that lost population shifted. The shift between the slides shows the gamble that is taken by the nature of this privacy system. Just because your tribal nation was okay in one test or multiple tests doesn't mean your tribal nation won't be the tribal nation that loses significant population in the next test or the official data set. Also, what isn't visually shown on this map is that for many tribal nations, the amount of population lost between the first and the second test actually worsened And tribal nations that lost population lost even more population than the previous test. It's important to remind you all at this point that each test is supposed to be a data improvement from the previous test. Next slide. Now we move on to the third test the Census Bureau ran. Unfortunately, these results can't be used to assess whether or not any improvements were made to the data quality. This is because variables and geographies previously used in the first two tests were removed for this test. Additionally, preventing a data quality assessment for improvement or worsening of the algorithm's impact on the data, a coding error occurred during this test when the Census Bureau ran the algorithm. The fourth data product on the next page is essentially the results of this test, but with that one coding error fixed. While we can't use these test results to attest any improvements or not to the data quality, what we can see here is again the gamble or the gaining and losing populations among tribal nations and how that shifts. Next slide. This is the fourth test the Census Bureau ran. Again, the primary difference between the fourth and the third test is the coding error. It was fixed for this one. We'll be looking at the results of this specific test on the following pages. The fourth test again shows the gamble and the shift between tribal nations, gaining and losing population. This is the most recent test results for testing the algorithm that have been made available at this point. Next slide. So this slide shows the 5 tribal nations with the highest total American Indian, Alaska Native population alone lost as a result of the privacy methods from the fourth and most recent test of the census privacy methods. The percent of population loss is dependent on the size of the population counted in the 2010 census. These losses represent millions of dollars lost for these tribes in the funding formulas. Next slide. This slide, we look into the tribal nations with the highest American Indian, Alaska Native alone population percent lost as the result of the privacy methods from the fourth and most recent test of the census privacy measures. It's important to note the top population losses in this test run were 100% population lost. There were 24 tribal nations with 100% American Indian, Alaska Native alone population loss. And these are only 5 of those 24 nations that lost 100% of their population. In the fourth and most recent test, again, what's shown here, of the new privacy methods, 34 tribal nations have between a 50% population loss and a 99 American Indian, Alaska Native alone population loss. Next slide. Now, running through the same series of map slides that we saw previously, we're going to look at examples of 2 tribes and how they progress through and the gamble that occurs during testing of the algorithm and the random nature of the algorithm. So we're looking here at Okayowingay and Santa Clara Pueblo. In the table next to the map image, we have the 2010 census population for both tribal areas in summary file 1 for American Indian and Alaska Native alone. Next slide. This slide shows the results from the first test and the impacts that the privacy measures had on these 2 tribal nations. The new population is in the third column labeled DAS Test 1 population, and the change in population from the 2010 summary file 1 is in the fourth column labeled population gain/loss. In this specific example, both tribes lost population. Next slide. Here's the second test that the Census Bureau released results for. We can see here a gamble a little bit more between whether you gain or lose population and the increase in population loss or the worsening of data between the first and the second test. Next slide. This is the third test, again, showing the randomness of population gains and losses. I need to re-emphasize that this is the test that we are unable to evaluate the numbers to assess whether the privacy measures improved or worsened due to the removal of variables, geographies, and to the coding error. We can't use this test to evaluate improvement or worsening of the system on data accuracy, but we can use this test to show more examples of the randomness in the gamble that does occur under this privacy system and the imbalance between nations. Next slide. Here's the visual for the fourth test results, again showing randomness of population gains and losses and the gamble that tribal nations are engaging with in the system. Next slide. These maps are interactive and available for anyone to use. These are the links for using the maps on your computer or smartphone device. Both links will work on either type of device, but the smartphone link will be formatted a little bit better for phone usage. When in the maps, you can click on the tribal nation you're interested in and the total population for each test, and the population gains and losses for each test will appear. I'll now pass this back over to Dr. Rubidoux.
Thank you, Gwen. And so here's where we are now and how you can help. Gwen showed how the application of the privacy methods and data releases to date has shown random losses of census counts in some tribal nations, and any loss of counts or accuracy is unacceptable. So we're working with other advocates to encourage extension of the deadlines and the DAS decisions, which could give more time for tribal consultation on the privacy methods. We encourage everyone to respond to the tribal consultation and let the Census Bureau know that you need as accurate and usable data as possible for your priority uses. And we will analyze the next data release to see if the improvements announced by the Census Bureau recently to tribal geographies can make the data better. We know many are calling on Congress for oversight on this issue. And basically, we need accurate census data for tribal nations and recognition of our political status so that we have data that is as accurate as other sovereigns, such as states. We hope you can attend the tribal consultation on this Thursday, February 18th, 2021, and respond to the questions in the email from the Census Bureau. Again, the 2020 census data is critical for American Indian, Alaska Native tribal nations for the data uses we listed at the beginning: redistricting, federal funding formulas, local tribal governance, and American Indian, Alaska Native research and surveillance. So think of all the uses of census data for tribal nations. What if that data was so inaccurate it was unavailable or could not be used? What if your tribal nation counts are made lower than the actual count? Why is accurate data so important? If you want to learn more, we have resources on our research recommendations page, policy updates, and webinars. There's a webpage on the U.S. Census Bureau website also where they publish updates. You can just Google the disclosure avoidance system term and you can find it. This is an evolving issue, but it's important to understand that the basic trade-off we're facing is privacy versus accuracy and usability of the data that's critical for our communities. This situation is unacceptable, and we hope you can join us in these efforts by learning more about the privacy methods and giving your input to the U.S. Census Bureau and Congress as soon as possible on the reasons why you need accurate census data. If you have any questions, please email us at research@ncai.org. And thank you for listening to this presentation. And I hope you can learn more about this topic and plan to attend the tribal consultation on Thursday, February 18th. Your voices are needed. Protecting the confidentiality of the Census Bureau data is important, but ensuring accurate counts for American Indians, Alaska Natives, and tribal nations is critically important as well. It's time to let the U.S. Census Bureau know how you feel about this topic. Thank you.